Welcome everybody, herzlich willkommen hier bei der
Welcome everybody to the summer event of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, the Desk Democracy and Innovation, and in particular the division responsible for gender and right-wing extremism or anti-right-wing extremism, thought that it would really make sense to begin the autumn season with a summer event. Please come on in. We only just got started. Before I introduce myself briefly and tell you a little bit about this event, let me inform you about the translation devices. If you want to listen to translation into German or English respectively, please choose the channel. Channel 1 for German, Channel 2 for English.
You can use the little technical translators, and Channel 2 is the English version and Channel 1 is the German version. We have two perfect simultaneous translators up there. Thank you so much. Danke da oben und auch danke an die Technik, dass wir das hier alles so hinbekommen.
Thanks very much to you in advance for your kind words of appreciation, and thanks very much to the technicians. And since I made technical remarks, you can also use the time while I'm speaking in order to switch your mobile phones to silent mode. Welcome. My name is Franziska Schröter. I would like to welcome you most cordially on behalf of all those who have helped organize this event. Male and female, of course. Welcome to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. This is meant to be an evening which is a mixture of an input, networking, and a general Q&A session at the end of the summer. We want to use the first topic of anti-feminism in order to raise voices against anti-feminist trends, and I would like to welcome you most cordially to stay around a little bit longer for reception after the event. My name is Franziska Schröter. I'm responsible for the project against right-wing extremism at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Professor Dr. Ursula Gutzegayo is responsible for gender-related issues, and the two of us organized this event. I would also like to thank our colleagues Vidya Schmidstra, Franziska Baumgart, and Katharina von Santen. Thanks very much for having organized this meeting. And thanks very much to our gender coordinator, our boss, Dr. Stefanie Elis, who's with us here today as well. Thanks very much for your contribution. But I would like to thank first and foremost our speakers of this evening's event. Well, Professor Dr. Cynthia Miller-Edred is responsible for the fact that we are all here because she spent her very last evening in Europe with us here today. We are delighted to have you, and we are really looking forward to your presentation. I'll introduce the speakers in a minute, but I would also like to thank Leni Breimeyer, Member of Parliament. She spends the evening of summer recess with us here at the FES. Thank you very much, Lena Breimeyer. Camilla Ferentz, she came here from Poland especially to join us. Welcome, Camilla. What's so exciting about this panel? We will have Ursula act as our moderators, our hosts. We have different generations here which are represented with different ideas of feminism. That makes us really happy because it's particularly important for us to further develop the idea of feminism, to think about intersectional approaches and to think about any kind of discrimination which should be countered or banned. And for anti-feminism, of course, is a very important part, but not the integral part. But today, we are going to focus on one partial area of anti-feminism only, and that is the following question: reproductive self-determination rights. How are they being dealt with at global scale? What is happening? There are simultaneous developments. You might have read about it in the invitation. The same day when in Germany the ban on advertisements for abortion were abolished, Section 219A, at the same day the Supreme Court in the US ruled that abortions are no longer permissible in the US. And therefore these rights were limited. We use this as an idea to think about international networks, starting off with the right-wing extremism and anti-democratic movement. we need to discuss this. Cynthia Miller-Idris is an expert in this particular regard. She understands German very well. This is why she's giving us a nod while the translators are still working on the translation. And I'm really looking forward to this exchange. In these times of crises, a lot of uncertainty, which is generally affecting us in our lives, it is very important for people to come together because they're open-minded. They are prone to right-wing propaganda and a devaluation of their basic principles and values. And for the organized right-wing extremist parties, this is quite favorable. And this is why I'm saying international problems require international solutions. And this is why we have a great panel together here today. That much as a general introduction. Let me briefly introduce the panelists to you, although this would take me half an hour if I did that properly. Well, Professor Cynthia Miller-Idris teaches at the University of American in Washington, D.C., amongst others. She's the director of Parental, the Radical Research Polarization Lab, which is a very exciting institution which deals with polarization and extremism. She's a sociologist, an expert in the field of right-wing extremism. She published a lot of books, amongst others, Hate in the Homeland and The Extreme Gone Mainstream. These titles really fit in nicely into our discussion tonight. And she also published something for the Friedrich Ebert Foundation 3, 4 or 2 years ago, shortly prior to the pandemic, a case study dealing with the triumph of women. In this publication, she dealt with the women's face of right-wing extremism and populism in the US. Highly recommendable. Everything's available online, by the way. And Cynthia Idris has studied German area studies in Cornell, and this is why she is so close to Europe, more than others maybe. So thanks very much for being here. We feel honored. On to Camilla Ferentz. I don't know who's traveled the longest. I'm not sure. Camilla Ferentz, an advisor, a lawyer for human rights. She's fighting for women's rights in Poland, also in the courts, pro bono. Very often, she's a lawyer pro bono 2020. So she's very much committed with her own strength and her own force in her leisure time to fight for women's rights and protect them and preserve them. She's the program director of FEDERA, the Foundation for Women and Family Planning, and the co-founder of the Foundation Against Rape Culture. For many years, she's been an activist in Poland. Poland is a very particular example that goes to show such an unhealthy balance between the government's power and extreme right-wing parties and conservative attitudes can accumulate and mix. Welcome to you. Leni Breimeyer, member of the German Parliament since 2017, if I remember correctly, and she's the spokesperson of the SPD and member of the Committee on Senior Affairs, Family, Youth and Women. So de facto, she is here in her particular position, and we're also looking forward to a lively exchange with you. Welcome, Leni Breimeyer. She used to work for trade unions in the past. And she also has very close ties to legal experts, although she's not trained as a legal expert by profession. I think she worked as the Constitutional Court in Baden-Württemberg for many years. And this is why it will be also interesting to hear from here about the legislative processes in this regard. So welcome, Leni Breimeyer, once again. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much. Now, please get actively involved in the panel discussion. Now, Ursula is going to take over as our moderator, but after Mrs. Cynthia Miller-Idris' presentation, we're going to have you ask questions before we start off with the general Q&A session. Now, Cynthia, the floor is yours.
Herzlichen Dank. I'll speak in English, although I feel slightly guilty about that, but thankfully we're not 100% German speakers here, and so I will stick with the language that is strongest for me. But thank you so much for the kind introduction. I also want to thank, in general, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for inviting me. It is indeed now officially the last 12 hours that I'm here in Germany. I take off tomorrow for the US at 6:30 in the morning, so I can't imagine a better place to be. This is a Stiftung that really is close to my heart, and the work of this evening as well, as you can tell. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here in my final hours. I also want to thank the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung that has hosted me for the last 2 months. I've been here in Germany as part of a residential cohort on social cohesion, and I see some friendly faces in the room who I spent time with this summer. Working on social cohesion, but also studying German prevention models related to right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism, racism, and other social ills. And it's been a really productive summer, and I feel very fortunate to have spent the time here. I'm just going to speak for about 15-20 minutes, and we'll focus on the US, but I would love in the discussion and answer to get into some of these international themes, but I want to talk to you a little bit about what we've been seeing happen in the US, and particularly what's happened over the last 2 months. I flew out of the US to move to Berlin for the summer on the evening of June 24th, 2022. It was just a few hours after the Supreme Court decision, which eradicated Americans' constitutional right to an abortion. The June ruling, as you all know, overturned Roe versus Wade, which was a 1973 Supreme Court decision that had previously established the right to an abortion without government interference. It's really hard to explain what it felt like to have that decision come down, even though it had been leaked previously, a few weeks earlier, and then to leave the country immediately. It really felt like I was flying out of a burning inferno. I mean, that sounds exaggerated perhaps, but it really felt like an escape. So tonight, the evening before I somewhat reluctantly return to the US, we're exactly 2 months past that decision. It's been exactly 2 months tonight. So I want to reflect especially on that, but I will talk a little bit more broadly as well about gender attacks on LGBTQ and trans communities and broader gender dynamics related to far-right and conservative movements. So let's see. First, I want to say 3 things about how we got here. The June 2022 decision from the Supreme Court was a completely predictable outcome of the Trump election, although no one, including me, wanted to believe it. Overturning Roe was a Trump campaign promise. He promised to do it. He said he would appoint the judges. And that was key to the support from evangelical Christians, which drove much of his success. It's embedded in a set of broader trends in the US related to Christian nationalism, the role of family values. So during an October 2016 presidential debate, Trump said, this is a quote, "Overturning Roe will happen automatically if he's elected president and could appoint judges to the Supreme Court." I didn't believe him. I didn't think most liberal and progressive Americans believed him. I think we thought it was just, more bluster, right? He was rallying his troops. He was, rallying conservatives, rallying the Trump base. But it's exactly what he did. So it was a long planned for and completely predictable outcome in many ways of that 2016 Trump victory. Because many of us refused to accept the possibility, and I include myself among that, I think it made it easier to believe what were, in retrospect, fundamental lies during the confirmation process hearings when candidate judges said that Roe was settled law. So we also believed that Roe was settled law, that these judges would not do it, and then it's exactly what they did. Of course, there were massive support from white evangelical voters for Trump, as I've talked about before. That support was driven in large part at the time by a belief that the country was on the wrong path. And a lot of that wrong path was embedded in discussions about family values and traditional gender roles, especially around the need to combat what often is referred to as moral degeneracy and evil in association with national decline. So these utopian promises, a kind of nostalgic golden age, appealed to a lot of white evangelical conservatives who were threatened by demographic and social change. And these were deeply gendered claims. The idea of moral degeneracy and national decline was often linked to the idea of American strength, and this kind of hyper-masculine bravado promised a leader who would restore and fight for them. So that's the first thing. It was a really predictable outcome of a campaign promise, essentially. But overturning it has to be understood in the context of much broader and global far-right populist and anti-elite rhetoric, along with anti-science trends, which are targeting gender in particular. This has been happening at least for a decade, but is increasing. So we've seen in the US, and I know globally as well, backlash against trans and non-binary communities, both in targeted far-right violence, but also significant state legislation attacking gender-affirming medical care, school health curriculum, the choice of children's literature in schools, and more. We've seen attacks on gender-neutral bathrooms, on changing pronoun use, on sports team participation when it's aligned with gender choice, with a gender identity. And these are highly polarizing issues that are part of bigger partisan fights. So they're very much caught up in Republican-Democratic divides as well. So in February of this year, Texas Governor Abbott directed the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to launch child abuse investigations into parents who provide gender-affirming treatments for their children, including hormone therapy to block the effects of puberty. In March, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed what is called the Parental Rights in Education Bill, which prevents teachers through third grade from discussing anything related to sexual orientation or gender identity. It's called don't say gay is the phrase that we often use to refer to it, but there are now a dozen states with similar legislation in progress. By June, state legislators had already introduced more than 300 anti-LGBTQ bills within the past year, including bans on transgender students playing on sports teams that align with their gender identity. But understand that, again, back into this partisan back and forth, in June, President Biden signed an executive order to protect transgender children in direct response to Texas and other state efforts to restrict gender-affirming medical care. These are ongoing partisan debates. They're not resolved, and they are really deeply embedded in fights over what states' rights are, as well as, of course, targeting families and children. We've also seen a rise globally in men's rights and anti-feminist movements and violence, including several mass attacks from involuntary celibates or incels, male supremacists, the mass murder of spa workers in Atlanta, attack on a New Jersey judge's family last year, a deeply toxic online misogynistic community in which the Uvalde, Texas mass shooter was embedded, all linked by a sense of male entitlement to women's sexual favor or broader misogynistic claims to power and superiority of men over women in particular. We are seeing campuses and schools, an ongoing particular target here. Universities are deemed sites of a subversive left or part of a cultural Marxist plot awash with radical sort of feminazis who will emasculate men, usurp their rightful power, the kinds of things we often hear. And gender studies is a particular target, the field itself, seen as part of a corrosion of gender roles, traditions, and family values, and part of a nefarious kind of what's called a gender ideology to eliminate so-called natural differences between the sexes. University often is then described as universities themselves as a danger to Western civilization by these folks and to the Christian religion, or described in what Posner calls cultural treason. So overturning Roe in that sense was part of a much bigger and broader strategy which aligns with the extreme right globally, which aligns with attacks on gender and reproductive rights globally. So it's not just one country's overturning, but it's seen, I think, in many ways as a success, and across the globe for folks who are trying to attack some of these rights. And it's driven at the local, the federal, and the global level. So it's not just in one place, not just one Supreme Court decision. Leading up to that decision, we saw in the US, for example, the Trump administration reinstate what was called a global gag rule, which stripped funding from international NGOs who provide abortion services. So this carries over into global relationships. And at the local or state level, prior to the Roe decision, in 2019 alone, over 30 states introduced legislation to ban or restrict abortion in anticipation of to get ready, basically, so that if Roe was overturned, they'd be ready with the legislation. And in fact, of course, they were. So what's happened? in the 2 months since. Even in the 2 months since, it's gone faster than I think most activists and reproductive rights specialists would anticipate. There's been a massive reduction in abortion access. 1 in 3 women in the US has already lost access to abortion since June 24th. That number will rise in the coming weeks as more states pass new legislation restricting and banning abortion. More than half of US states have already or expected to ban abortion, which will affect 58% of women of reproductive age in the US. Within a month of the decision, at least 43 abortion clinics had already closed across 11 states. At least 11 states so far have passed what are called heartbeat bans, meaning abortion is banned from the time a heartbeat is heard, at about 6 weeks when many people do not yet know they're pregnant. We have 5 other states trying to pass that legislation, but currently caught in lawsuits or judges' injunctions against that legislation. This tells you a little bit about how complicated it is. There are lawsuits in almost every state, I would say now. In Texas, doctors who perform an abortion are subject to a life sentence now in prison. In that state, there are no exceptions for rape or incest. Anti-abortion activists continue to mobilize, seeing the June ruling as a tremendous success. They're now seeking a slate of new measures, including bans on out-of-state travel for abortion, the establishment of legal rights for fetuses, and the removal of exemptions for victims of rape. The other thing I want to sort of add is, though, that we've seen ongoing, this is the sort of, I'm going to try to give you some optimism here. So ongoing federal, state, and corporate resistance to this. But this adds to the complex landscape of what's happening. So the Biden administration signed an executive order last month. Biden signed an executive order to try to mitigate some of the impacts of the Supreme Court ruling, to offer support for for states to provide out-of-state costs, right? Knowing that in some states, these costs are going to go up high as people travel. To establish protections for patient privacy so the records can't be searched, et cetera. So Biden is hoping and is working on reversing the impact of the Supreme Court decision. The fastest way to do that would be to pass a federal law legalizing abortion access, which we've never had. So Roe versus Wade wasn't a law that gave abortion access. It just prevented the states from interfering. But there's not enough votes right now. The Democrats don't have enough votes to pass that at this time. As I said, there's a lot of legal issues going on. There are lawsuits across the country to block those abortion bans, arguing that they violate state constitutions. I think what we should expect is a confusing and messy array of bans, court blockages, revisions, refinements to happen in at least half of US states over the coming months. No one's going to really understand what the landscape of access looks like. For many people who show up to get abortions right now, they're being told, they have to go 7-8 hours at least to neighboring states, and some of these states, all the states around them, of course, have also banned it. We have now seen a number of private sector companies offer to provide and cover the costs of abortion-related travel. So that's another thing that's happening, but there are legal challenges to that. Amazon, Apple, Disney, Netflix, many large companies have rewritten their health insurance policies to cover travel costs for employees seeking an abortion out of state, including covering the cost of travel, hotel rooms, et cetera. Those companies are being either sued or threatened with lawsuits by the states, so that's going to continue on as well. And finally, one of the most confusing things happening is that states and counties from Democratic states are starting to ban travel of their employees to other states for work-related business if there are no reproductive rights or if LGBTQ rights are threatened. So for example, in the county next door to Washington, all business travel to any state with an abortion ban is no longer possible. So anyone who works for the state, so a professor in California, for example, who's a professor at Berkeley, would not be able to go to a conference in Texas using university funds. I mean, this affects everyone who is a state employee. So you can imagine the cascading effects of this with the resistance and the symbolic decisions at the local and state level that are potentially truly chaotic in implementation and with wide-ranging effects professionally. Finally, most recently, we have really seen some documentation that there's been significant backlash through voter registration. So this is one of the more hopeful things, I would say, from a feminist perspective. There have been massive increases in voter registration, heavily driven by young women under the age of 25. And so high and so quick that we are starting to anticipate there may be changes in as early as the 2022 elections. We're seeing some voter backlash that's anticipated in ways that I think we should anticipate will continue over the next couple of election cycles. So in conclusion, what's the impact on democracy for this, in the US at least, if not globally? Trust in the Supreme Court has dropped to a historic low. We've never seen it this low. Millions of Americans, including me, have lost faith in what used to be a highly regarded institution. The Dobbs decision happened after a president who had lost the popular vote was able to appoint 1/3 of the sitting justices, and it happened after at least 2 of those justices lied during the confirmation hearings and said Roe versus Wade was settled law and they would not seek to overturn it. It happened despite the fact that the significant majority of Americans are pro-choice, so it cannot, in any sense of the word, be considered a democratic outcome. It does not represent the will of the majority. For me and millions like me, this is one of many, if not the final blow, to what little faith remained in our democracy, coming on the heels of massive blows in trust of law enforcement, many other acts of police brutality that led to that, significant distrust in the electoral system, low levels of approval and trust in Congress and the presidency. This now historic low in confidence in the Supreme Court is a significant blow, I would say, to the stability of US democracy. So I'm struggled. If you know me on social media at all, you know that I struggled, and I tweeted out last week, like, please help me, send me some points of optimism that I can give this audience next week. And people really pointed out that the optimism here is counterintuitive, but importantly rooted in anger, that people are angry in the US, women are unbelievably angry, I would say, in the post-Roe context, and they're mobilizing. So I do think this decision will bring a massive wave of backlash as voters become mobilized, as younger generations register. They have historically not turned out to vote. And then show up at the polls. And I do think that mobilization will have an impact in the long run, possibly even in the 2022 and 2024 elections. But I also think that the loss of trust and confidence in the country's highest court, and by extension in our democracy itself, is going to be extremely difficult to repair and will last for generations. That is, if our democracy lasts that long at all.
Oh, Cynthia, that was hard. We will have the panel discussion and comments from Camilla and Leni in a second. I just want to give the audience the chance to ask. Warum mache ich das auf Englisch? Wir haben eine Übersetzung.
Why am I doing this in English? Does the moderator wonder? If there are questions of clarification, please feel free to fire now, because Cynthia Miller-Idris might be able to give you an additional piece of information. Anything else will be shifted to the general Q&A session. Are there any questions? Questions of clarification? That does not seem to be the case. Great. So we will have much more time for the Q&A session. That's great. My colleague has already taken a seat. Let me welcome her once again officially, because such a gender expert in our midst is a wonderful thing to have. Professor Dr. Ursula Bizzugayo, apart from being responsible for the gender-related issues at the FES, she also works at the Institute for Political Studies and Sciences at the University of Bonn. And of course, there she also deals with gender-related issues and anti-feminism. And Uschi is now going to host the event tonight. And now I'd like all the panelists to join us up here on the stage. Cynthia, please take a seat. Leni, Camilla, please join us up here. Thank you very much.
So, von mir auch nochmal ein ganz herzliches.
I would also like to welcome you most cordially. Welcome to Berlin, to all of our guests. I'm delighted to see that so many of you have taken the time to come here on such a beautiful summer evening in order to join us. Welcome to all of you up here in the panel. This is an international panel, and we're dealing with a very important topic. And that is exactly the way in which we should discuss these topics in the future. Anti-feminism is a topic that needs to be addressed at global scale because it's not only a national problem. We have an anti-feminist movement the world over. It uses its parliamentary representatives in order to exert influence on our democracies. It's not Trumpism in the US, which has kept us busy for many years already, but we in the German parliament as well, with the AfD, the right-wing party, have a committed anti-feminist party in our midst. It fights against reproductive rights and self-determination in gender-related issues and makes very clear and unambiguous political statements. This is why it is of the essence that we have a transnational discussion. My first preliminary ideas before this event was organized was the following. We're living in the age of extremist times in the 20th century. We are privileged in Germany to live in one of the Western democracies which are still stable and highly technologized. We live in a tame type of capitalism, and we promise our citizens a lot of freedom. Now, if you ask young people, you would be led to believe about the question of how are we going to live together in the future. Do you want to have children, yes or no? Most youngsters would reply, yes, of course. Any woman, every person should have the freedom of choice to decide on his or her own life, on his or her own sexuality, partner. Each person should be free to decide on whether to have children, yes or no. Also, your fellow citizens or the friends that you meet during your leisure time, which are part of transgender groups, LGBTIQ members of the group, should also be able to think about having a family. And they should be self-determined in deciding how to live a family life. I think this is something that young persons normally take for granted, but at the same time there are very difficult cross-generational bridges which are partly blocked. This does not only relate to our gender-specific understanding within families or our daily lives, but it also affects the feminist discourse more so than ever before. Here we come together, coming from different generations, and we are discussing our learning processes by using harsh languages, because new participants of the discourse do not know how LGBTIQ people or queer people need to be involved in the discourse. But what unites us all is the following. We are facing new alliances. There are new right-wing parties, people which are very much ideologized. Some of our fellow citizens try to make their voices heard and try to exert a very strong influence also in our parliament. In Germany, we were quite happy to see that the government and the new Bundestag de facto abolished Section 2019A, which means that it is no longer possible to ban advertising for abortion. Mrs. Breimer, you were involved in the entire process. Your colleagues in the parliament, did they make any anti-feminist statements? How did this process go? How was it influenced by the opponents? Hello, good evening. Thank you for the invitation and thank you for this wonderful presentation, Cynthia. On to Section 219A, we reached agreement rather quickly in the course of the coalition agreements. We jointly decided to abolish this section. Full stop. The Greens, the SPD, the Liberals, There was no doubt about it. But there were some more doubts with regards to the following questions. The Greens and the Social Democratic Party had conflicts concerning pregnancy conflicts should not be dealt with by legal terms. This is what was part of the discussion. What occurred to me was that in the course of the debate about Section 219A Penal Code, we only spoke about Section 280 because we got lost in the course of the discussion. The AfD also tried to distract us, but this also happened within the Union. They always pretended as if we wanted to abolish Section 218. With hindsight, when did this discussion started? When Christina Helgin, one of the main protagonists, who is a general practitioner who carries out abortions in her general theatre, spoke to one of our colleagues and was taken to court. Why? What is this all about? It would be wrong to say that somebody looks up something in the internet and says, well, this is advertisement. But Paris Section 219 banned this. It is not permissible, so let's try to make our voices heard. But, as we said before, this is something that would be prepared over a long period of time by people who can raise a lot of financial resources, organizations who are very well funded. That is the only way in which this became possible. If you let people know in the internet that you carry out abortions, this is advertising. And of course, for many years, we've had a discussion by people who said, well, it won't be easy to find medical doctors who are willing to do abortions any longer. So you can't go to a hospital any longer where you can have an abortion because, our opponents wanted to increase the level of uncertainty. Over the entire period of time, we never really spoke about advertising or different types of advertising, but we always spoke about Section 218, the others. And this is what I found really annoying. And then we always had this Polish clout over our horizon. I said this time and again over the recent years. When we looked at Poland, we said, well, it is not only about abortion, but it's also about not letting people use contraception below the age of 18, no sexual education in schools. The pandemic had just started, and then we had masks being printed with the right arrow on the white background. And we expressed our solidarity as strongly as we could. And I always say, it's not about us German women expressing our solidarity with our poor Polish colleagues. But if there are strange constellations over here, if the AfD gains much more weight and more swing, then we will end up with similar situations in Germany. But this is a worldwide movement, and this worldwide movement is what we need to be part of. We need to express our solidarity with all the women who fight for women to have a right of abortion, no matter where they are. Thank you very much. Lini, you gave us a very good piece of information about truckers in recent years in Poland. With the rainbow protest movement and these beautiful protest expressions of women in many cities rallied tens and thousands of women. This protest led to the fact that the PSI and the Kaczynski government tried to sort of not give abortion or a ban of abortion and a ban on contraception not the priority. But it's even more interesting to see that this new law was now passed and you're threatened to be pushed into prison for 3 years. And Camilla promised me that she's going to give us the name of the Polish activist, and she knows how to pronounce this. I wrote down the name. But Camilla, what is the story in Poland? Why does the Polish government and the PSI decide now to take more restrictive measures against the activists in Poland and the anti-abortionists in your country? And the protest movement, the rainbow movement, where is it currently at? Where is this movement taking place?
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for having me, for inviting me. Yeah, we are talking about the activist Justyna Wydrzyńska. Yeah, she right now has her court trial because helping in having an abortion is criminalized in Poland, and she did this act of solidarity, and she sent abortion pills to one of the Polish women who really needed that. Yeah, and she was caught by the police, and she has a criminal trial. But yeah, this is a part of a broader picture of Polish both abortion, but also activism, for example, for LGBT plus rights activism, with targeting activists, with targeting all the people who are engaged, who are ready to be active in that, who want to raise a voice, because in fact in Poland, in regard to abortion or other minorities' rights, for example, the situation has never been good since, I would say, 1989, the moment of economic and political transformation. That can be a symbolic moment in the time, that we constantly since then we have to deal with patriarchy, hierarchy, trying to take over our lives, to control our lives, and this is done in different ways, or by banning abortion, by attempts to ban abortion, which was in fact finalized in 2020, because since 1989 we had a lot of attempts to ban abortion totally, but the most important one was in 2016. Yeah, that was a surprise, because on one hand, there was a really strict and strong draft bill on introducing total ban on abortion, together with jail penalty for women who have had abortion. And that was surprisingly strict legislative proposal. But on the other hand, it caused huge social mobilization. People, especially women, all those persons who could get pregnant, eventually find out that, for many years we've been treated as objects, as incubators. We pay a lot of social costs for that we can get pregnant, and we really do get pregnant, that we earn less, we have to combine our lifetime tasks, we need to do a lot of unpaid care work, reproductive work, and now finally somebody wants to control our lives, our future. Somebody from above, from the establishment, would say if I should continue the pregnancy or I shouldn't, sometimes in a very difficult, tragic situation, although, every situation can be difficult for someone. We cannot judge which deserves to be treated as something tragic and respected, and which not. But it was about a total ban on abortion. It was about jail penalty. So since 2016, when the black protest burst out in Polish streets, we had both polarization in the society, mobilization, but also more stronger and stronger attempts of fundamentalists to reach their goal, to finally change the law. And to my mind, they put a lot of pressure on the government, which, in fact, in 2016 rejected the draft bill on total ban on abortion. But what happened in 2020? Then, eventually, this ban was introduced. Of course, it concerned one of the abortion grounds, the situation when there is a huge fetal impairment. We know that fetus, if it will be born, then it won't survive the birth, or it won't be able to live independently without suffering. And this abortion ground was erased from the legal system, but not by the decision of the parliament, when we can deal with some political liability, responsibility, when we can ask a member of the parliament, why did you vote for that? No, they, first of all, hijacked the public institutions, namely the Constitutional Tribunal. They appointed their own judges, dependent on who were dependent on the ruling party, on the government. They were the previous members of the party sometimes. They were clearly connected to the government. And those judges in the Constitutional Tribunal in October 2020 passed the judgment that no, abortion in case of fetal impairment is unconstitutional. And that was a disaster, because that concerned so tragic situations when, you find out that there will be no happy and good ending. When sometimes your health, your mental, your physical health is at risk, because those medical issues are connected. And your own state tells you that, no, it's impossible. So that caused a huge mobilizations once again. People went out to streets. And since then, I think we can, this is a paradox, can be grateful somehow to the very right-wing government that it increased the social awareness. Right now we have 66% in favor of liberalization of abortion. This is the highest score in the history of social polls. So in fact, the social dynamics are very, very quick right now. And yet, coming back to the rainbow demonstrations, this is pretty the same. This is all about controlling the society, who you may live with, who you can marry, if you can adopt a child, or even if you can identify yourself. It's about your identity. If you can identify as this or that, if you can say openly, I'm gay, or I'm transgender person. The government wanted us to only follow their point of view and only their, lifestyle. So they wanted to erase some people from the community. This is very anti-community policies. And we are struggling all the time. But in fact, I think the society is stronger right now, thanks to that.
Thank you, danke. Ja. Ja.
That's a wonderfully optimistic end. I repeat, that was a wonderfully optimistic end. Just right, I think. I would like to quote Simone de Beauvoir, who said early on that all it needs is a political, economic or religious crisis in order to once again threaten the rights of women. And the crisis of modernity in the 21st century, the pandemic, the war crisis, these have a huge potential. And dear Leni, this is also very much the subject that you have, abortion, punishment, regulations of abortion. That's very much a topical issue, because we see that women from Ukraine who've been raped, they will be given a home in Europe. And they are faced with the immediate problem that they were raped as a means of war, and they are highly traumatized. We also see many Ukrainian women like this coming to Poland, which is particularly interesting. So, can we say that in the United States, of course, it's the crisis, the pandemic in particular, which has exacerbated the polarization already existing? Or, Leni, is this what caused you, apart from COVID and social security packages, relief packages, to suddenly really address this particular issue? Leni, perhaps, and Cynthia?
Interesting question. The pandemic, there's no question in my mind that the pandemic has deepened and broadened the rift between Democrats and Republicans, I would say. So the partisan polarization was strengthened by what became highly politicized things that shouldn't have been politicized, like do you wear a mask or not, became very politicized, right? Can schools allow mask policies? The vaccine mandates, vaccine decisions became very polarized. So every single decision related to the pandemic, shutdown orders, became very politicized, as we see then on January 6th, of course, when the election disinformation machine itself contributed to anti-maskers, pro-Trumpers, a whole coalition of people joining forces with more organized militia, white supremacist groups as well. So I think it is absolutely deepened. And also, everyone, I don't know how it feels in the rest of the world, but to watch this, but the unbelievable rates of gun ownership in the US. We've had record-breaking gun sales across the country throughout the pandemic. We've had ammunition shortages. And the guns are being purchased on the left as well as on the right. So it's not only that people are arming themselves on the right, but people on the left are starting to feel they need to arm themselves as well. And that it's a very tense situation to feel like at any moment there could be violence, and even in violence, not just mass violence, but in ordinary ways. We're seeing increasing what we call road rage shootings, just people shooting at someone out of their car because they got cut off in traffic. People are attacking people because they get asked to wear a mask, right? Not with a gun necessarily, but getting into fist fights. So the anger is really palpable between ordinary citizens and at the government, and people are really seeking, I think, ways to prepare for potential additional violence in ways that are very, very troubling. So some of that's pandemic, some of that is disinformation, some of that is disinformation and election disinformation combined with pandemic. I mean, the conditions of the pandemic didn't help. Certainly when you're spending more time virtually than you are in person, there's also a distancing, I think, of humanity in some ways. That we could talk about, what happens over social media. So all of these things kind of blend together in a sort of toxic mix, or what we might call a tinderbox of potential. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Leni?
I think that if during the pandemic the government hadn't done anything, then the same people would still have tried to heat up the emotions of people. Any subject is right to try and incite people to violence. I mean, using uncertainty is something which is popular. We've seen that in the last 2 years and also the preceding years. And when it comes to abortion, my perception is, which can be very personal, of course, but still I think that since the last ruling of the German Constitutional Court, there hasn't really an abortion debate anymore. I noticed that when we negotiated our coalition agreement. I mean, we said we won't discuss matters in public, and so one should do this. But several times an argument was put forward how important it is to protect unborn life. I was born in 1960, and if I hear people talk about protecting unborn life, I feel like sort of really hitting out at people. So honestly, I mean, this is when I flip the lid. I mean, that's my socialization, right? That's how I grew up. But then I noticed that there was one of our young colleagues, a very young MP from the Social Democrats, and we have about 206 MPs, 104 are new, 50 of them are under 35 years old. And that brought home to me that there's a new thinking coming with these young people. And he said to me, we're talking about protecting unborn lives. I mean, we all know that, abortion doesn't protect unborn life, it just endangers women and so on and so forth. I mean, all this litany that we know so well, we put that forward, and he said, well, isn't there another way of protecting this unborn life? And he talked about deterrence of punishment, and he talked about what there could be. It was a bit like a table tennis game. Ping pong here, this way. We need large apartments. Women need to be able to afford their living conditions. That is a way of protecting human life. For the first time, we discussed it in this very different way. But the problem I've seen all this time is that I notice that, well, we see that the right-wing parties, they're sort of really revving up their arguments, everything. We talk about things in a different way. People say, well, I'm a young woman, I'm doing what I like, I go to university, and then I'll start with my career. And I don't even think about abortion issues at all, or about equality, because I don't need to think about it because I enjoy equality. So we are no longer used to going out on the streets. I mean, my last perception of this was when an old CDU conservative, Heiner Geisler, was still the Ministry of Family Affairs, and I remember collecting signatures and handing them to him. But right now, it's not a social movement anymore. And 219A, the section 219A, we realized we can abolish it. It doesn't cost any money. There's no problem with the taxes. We say, right, we get rid of it, and we do it. And we did. As simple as that. And we were all very happy about it because it sent out a strong signal into the population saying, right, once you have a majority, you can make things happen. And if we have the majorities, we can also strike down Section 218, but we need a majority for that. But where are the people to fight our fight with us? Situation that in Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, or other parts of Germany, you have to drive 2 or 3 hours before you find any doctor willing to perform an abortion. Come on, people. I mean, this has been a situation which has been going on for years, and that's horrid. So, I mean, all of this is being individualized. But on the other hand, we also see a lot of people who use a lot of money and a lot of ideology in putting spanners in our works, as it were. They have female anchor women at the news. We've got a wonderful Speaker of the Parliament. We've got a Defence Minister. Well, all these are women, so the feminist world is all right. We don't need anything more. That's their view, and that's not right. Thank you, Leni. Perhaps we can also say that a large-scale protest movements, starting from the people most affected, can't even happen at the moment, because there are so many different ways of negotiating these issues and at so many different levels. When we're talking about self-determination, reproductive rights, it's not necessarily just in Germany. It's the same in other countries in Europe, in the United States. There are so many different manifestations. Camilla, what is the situation like in the Polish debate? You have a much more constrained debate, and you can't be as public because the legal situation is so extremely restrictive. But do you in Poland have sort of limits to how far people are willing to be in solidarity with you? Are there different camps of the debate? Is everybody speaking with one voice among those concerned, or are there different arenas, different levels, and different debates, like trans people on the one hand, LGBTIQ on the other hand, women from different generations? I mean, is it heterogeneous or not? Is there social pressure from below? Is it hard to organize? Or are we speaking about a problem which we only have in some societies where it's very easy to speak out freely?
Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, no, the debate is not unified. We have very different angles of it. Debate on abortion and on LGBT plus rights. Because I should start with that Poland is a very specific country with very strong position and tradition of Catholic Church, with very specific history, with some, feelings of ashamed, of being neglected, of being not visible in the European geographical, historical dynamics. So Polish people have some issues that come up when we discuss abortion. We need to remember that abortion was and still is trapped since 1993 in so-called abortion compromise. It was seen, or it was presented as compromise, but in fact that was a political agreement made over persons who could get pregnant heads between new establishment that was settled up after 1989 and the Catholic Church, and they tried to pursue, to convince us that we meet in the middle, but it wasn't in the middle. It was a deprivation of the fundamental right to decide on your bodily autonomy, about your future, about your private life. Yeah, when we were, as women, let's say, left with only 3 situations, very restrictive situations when we could get access abortion in public hospitals. And only in public hospitals, no on the commercial market of healthcare services. But that legal situation shaped people's imaginations, together with religion classes at schools, which were started since 1989. And I must say, they presented during these religious classes anti-choice propaganda with films, with posters. Today, we can see on Polish streets the so-called bloody posters. They show chopped bodies of fetuses covered in blood, and they say abortion is a murder. So, and we as Polish people has this inclinations towards romanticism. So you can imagine how our Polish imagination works. In fact, pregnancy, fetuses, could be really easily transformed into this language something and called unborn children, because this imagination has been shaped by very restrictive law and law changes attitudes, by the patriarchy that was in very high, strong position, and it's still in Poland. We haven't had a proper education. Still, we of course have the formal theoretical position that in constitution there is equality between men and women, but in fact, when you enter schools, hospitals, offices, then you experience patriarchy, stereotypes. We are not equal in practice. And that all together leads us to the situation that it's really difficult, in fact, to prove, to discuss that the right to decide if I want to continue the pregnancy or not, if I can have a same-sex marriage or can I adopt a child as a same-sex couple, it's very, very hard, very difficult. There are a lot of prejudices present in the debate. And of course, as I previously said, there is an increase in the social awareness, consciousness that, well, in fact, if we want to have a real freedom, we need to allow other people to be free in their choices. Although it's not always a free choice when you are in a very bad economical situation. This is also an issue that should be present in the debate. But still, this debate is somehow missing this point. And that's also the source of frustration of people who come from very difficult background economically, or they live in rural areas, and in fact they have firstly they have some economical problems to struggle. They are under huge influence of the Catholic Church, and they have the feeling that they need to have some hidden life. If they need to have a same-sex partner or to have an abortion, this is something that should be hidden. They cannot come up with, openly with this situation, with this idea, and that's why the discussion in Poland is so difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can observe in Germany that especially conservative groups, church-based groups, focus on small families. This is where a lot of citizens come together, and they feel provoked by a modern age which overtaxes and overburdens them to a certain extent, or puts their own concept of life and theory of life into question, when these new voices all of a sudden appear. People have the feeling that their own lifestyle is being put into question by different political groups, by new groups of people who are finally active in the discussion, who were not used to present themselves in the media, that nobody was used to. And maybe in the social media, they are not represented or do not want to be presented. What's the story like in the US? The anti-abortionists who are trying to fight this chaos, do they provoke Black Lives Matters and the Me Too movement? Do they provoke particular groups? Or would it be true to say that male groups are now cooperating and coordinating who would not have come together in the past, but who unite in these particular opinions and try to make their voices heard? And Leni, what's the story like in your constituency? How do the citizens that you speak to on a day-to-day basis react to your policy of slow anti-criminalization of abortion or new gender rights? Cynthia.
Question. I think there are a couple of different things to unpack in that set of questions. One, I think it's really important to understand both the sense of threat that you are talking about, both from the conservative right and the far right. You often hear it as a defense of Western, so-called Western civilization. We often hear the words European heritage used as a placeholder for whiteness in the US as well. So there's an idea here coming from the far right that is that there's a demographic threat and that there is a decline, a degradation of values. And we've been seeing that, of course, every time a Democratic president comes into play, especially after Obama came in and a lot of social changes were ushered in at once. So that's really important to understand, that sense of threat and the sense of protection of family values that you hear threaded throughout the language in the attacks on schools, on school curriculum, all of the anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ rhetoric as well as, and the anti-abortion movement is part of that, right, is a part of this idea. But the other interesting thing that you said that I want to also reference is that Roe versus Wade itself was based on a premise about privacy. And so it's not just a right to abortion. It wasn't a right to abortion per se. It was a right to not have interference from the government in your private life, that the government couldn't interfere in your private life related to your reproductive choice. And that's really important because the way the entire legal system works in the US is about precedent. A lot of other rights now rest on that same right. And so the right to contraception was based off of Roe, the right to same-sex marriage, the right to interracial marriage. A lot of other rights are now at risk because this idea of privacy itself and government interference into your private life is undermined by the loss of Roe. If Roe has fallen, then so are all of these other rights equally vulnerable. And in fact, we're already anticipating and expecting challenges, and in fact, they're probably already underway, challenges to all of those rights as well. So So it is, I think, this fundamental question about what happens in your private life, as we're just hearing. What is your right to make a decision without interference from the government about your own body, about whom you have sex with, about who you marry, about whether you have a child or not? These are all of the collection of things related to family values, but they're related to an individual choice as well. And I think that's a really important distinction. In terms of just this question about protest and counter-protest and groups and antagonism against each other, you do see it a little bit sometimes in street protests, but I haven't seen it as much as you might think. I feel like, but again, I've been absent the last 2 months. I feel like I need to go back home and find out what's actually happening on the ground. I think people have also gotten a lot more careful about the way that they organized on social media right now. And a lot of this will become clear once I'm face-to-face in conversation with people as well.
Thank you. Leni, wie erklärst du?
Leni, how do you, in your constituency, explain your initiatives and your political positions? Well, well, well. The truth is that I don't receive that many questions. People feel a very strong feeling of longing towards a strong man. Put your foot down. You know, a lot of citizens tell me that they are longing for, I don't know, Trumps, Erdogans, Johnsons, all these toxic guys up there in the political realm. You know, this is what you get to hear. But if people think a little bit more and don't want to put their foot down and try to be a bit more considerate and try to find a solution in a difficult situation, in a federalist system, in a democratic system, sometimes you really lack the understanding. That's the feeling I got. Apart from that, I think the issue of violence, of course, is much more significant in the US than it is here in Germany. But I don't have the feeling that we could pretend as if the problem did not exist. Winnenden is 30 kilometers away from where I live. This is where one young person ran amok. And if you take a very closer look, people run amok and we think that this is really terrible. But people ask themselves about the victims pretty late. The victims are predominantly female pupils and teachers. So something's really happening in this regard. And, you know, behind closed doors, you've got your 3-bedroom flat or whatever. And this is where people watch their porn movies, where women are abused, misused, are always offended and humiliated on an ongoing basis. All this happens behind closed doors. And this is not what we discuss openly in our society, but this really also has an influence on the way in which we see women. And I always thought we move forward, sometimes a bit slower, sometimes a bit faster, but I always thought that we always move forward, but that's completely wrong, because we're also partly moving backwards. You know, we want to keep the status quo as usual, and, you know, there's only a limited amount of energy left to think about where we really want to go. Yes, I think we are moving into the right direction. We are saying that people are singing and praying in front of the abortion practices or the counseling centers of Pro Familia, but it's totally unacceptable. You know, if people are trying to look for support, these women need to be supported. And now we're about to adopt this law in our coalition agreement. They should not be harassed on the sidewalk either. But that's a difficult path to embark upon. But nevertheless, we address that issue. That makes me happy. You know, those people who have the right political attitude go into retirement. And why not teach about abortion in medical training? That is important, and we have some of these items in our coalition agreement, and this makes me believe that we are moving on. But still, we are living in a world, we are much more backward and much more anti-feminist than we were 10 years ago. And that is something that we have to become aware of. And I think we still haven't learned to understand the problem. And when I tell a 20-year-old girl how she's being discriminated against, she looks at me as if I was crazy. It's just like her granny telling her about the war. And it's really difficult to raise awareness and to raise political awareness. I don't really want to talk about the youth and blame them. They are really excellent young people. There's no doubt about it. But we are so much depoliticized. We fought for gender equality commissioners. Now they've been appointed. But what do they fight for? Well, feminism in a rather soft way. We need a little bit more commissioners for people with physical impairments, for refugees, all these in one particular office in the city halls. And, you know, they don't really have the right awareness for feminism. And then only general issues are being addressed. Pedophilia, child abuse is really bad. You know, this is one of the topics that we devote a lot of energy to. And it sounds good, but nobody really likes to address topics which are really painful. The harsh discussions are missing. You know, we don't bang our heads. That's the problem. Everything's just too soft, and we try to present everything in a rosy light. I think this is rather painstaking, and I hope that we will make more progress. Now, we're here in Germany, and I think, too, that we've got to do our homework. And I do hope that we will have a bit more time and energy left for international networking, because the others, the bad guys, have established international ties, and we need to do the same. We need to use that additional time and energy to establish international ties. I've seen your face so many times in international magazines, and I'm sitting beside you. I feel deeply honored, I have to say. And you know, I want to take a picture, most definitely, so later on, if I may.
Well, perhaps coming to the end of the meeting, there are 2-3 progressive stances we might develop, how solidarity and above all an exchange or an understanding can be organized across national borders. And Leni has pointed a few interesting things out. But in that spirit, I would like to ask our guests to ask their questions to our panelists, or just to make their comments. We've got 2 colleagues with roving mics, so please indicate that you wish to say something. And please don't be angry. They will keep the mic in their own hand. Just hand it close to you. That's part of our COVID safety measures, I'm afraid. And there is a young gentleman in the front with a white shirt. He's the first. Thank you very much. I can ask in English or in German. It would be very nice if you could hear your name. Michael Zabriga, European Council on Foreign Relations. And I have 2 questions to Cynthia.
The first question is about the incel movement in general. And you've mentioned the Dobbs case, obviously. And I was wondering, since the incel movement has kind of been emboldened by, since the whole narrative of an involuntary celibatism has become more mainstream lately with memes, dark MAGA, all that stuff, what do you think, how did the incel movement react to the Dobbs case? Have they felt emboldened even more? I think you probably know the conversations online, so what are the kind of reactions to that online? That's the first question. And then the second one, you've mentioned kind of the cascading effect that Dobbs could have on other civil liberties. And in that sense, I'm thinking about, I don't know how to pronounce it, Obergefell, I think. So the same-sex marriage, the right to same-sex marriage in the US. What do you think, how likely is it that that gets overturned as well? Maybe keeping in mind the kind of grassroots activism that we do see, the kind of positive developments. Could that mitigate or at least postpone such a possible decision? At least after the midterms, for instance.
Thank you. Wir nehmen noch eine zweite und dritte Frage dazu.
We're going to have a second and a third question. There was a lady with curly brown hair, so you with the second, and there was a blonde lady on the left-hand side from me. Thank you. I'm Danessa Gob. I'm a member of the German Association of Women. Many thanks for all the contributions. My question goes to Leni. When Section 219A was struck in the press conference, it was emphasized that soon a commission was supposed to be set up regarding reproductive rights. What is the status? We don't have that much time. Something should happen. And I would also like to comment on something Leni says. Because, we've got the idea of the non-politicized youth, young women get everything, like manna from heaven, they're no longer activists. And I'm a bit upset by that because it's not my perception. I know a lot of feminist groups. We're very well networking with each other, doing wonderful demonstrations every 8th of March, for example, working against femicides, which is definitely needed. And there are a lot of feminist groups trying to do something, trying to make sure that there are statistics on the number of femicides, but there are no police statistics about this. 219A, 218, these are sections which have always been very active. The Young Socialists, for example, Young Social Democrats have been doing this for many years, and it's a similar situation with other feminist groups in the young generation. It's my impression that many young women are very much aware of the fact that equality isn't a matter of course, particularly with global developments showing us that the clock can be turned back a bit. So I'm a bit bothered when the situation is sort of depicted as young people no longer go out on the streets. Could you tell us your name, please? That would be lovely. Nina Meln, sorry. So, I think this was wonderful. Cynthia first, please.
Thank you for the questions. So the incel movement, for those in case people are not aware of it, it refers to the involuntary celibates. These are it's a broad movement. The violent fringe is mostly what we focus on in my research lab, where we have a couple of specialists who study male supremacist rhetoric online and also violent mobilization. So I would have to check with them to know more empirically kind of what's happening with the reaction. I'm happy to do that. But in general, I would say theoretically and in general, based on what their belief system is, this is a tremendous victory, right? Anything that reduces women's rights for a violent male incel community, a male supremacist community, would be a victory if you're reducing women's rights. So the incel community has been growing. The violent incel community that is with tremendous rage against women and who feel that women really shouldn't have the same rights and aren't entitled to the same rights. Related to that, I've also seen, even quite recently, some far-right activists lobbying for reduction of voter rights, for eradicating voter rights for women as well. So, arguing that there'll be faster progress that way, right? So I think, these are complete fringe movements and at the same time quite dangerous. In terms of Obergefell and the possibility of same-sex marriage and contraception, I would say falling, I can't emphasize enough how unpredictable everything feels right now. It's impossible to predict. And part of that is because a lot is hinging, I think, on voter mobilization and on activist mobilization as well. We're seeing a lot of mobilization. If there's enough, if we get to a point where we can see federal legislation protect these rights, instead of just resting on a privacy ruling, which essentially makes it easier to return that control back to the states, I think that's where we're going to start to see more protection of these rights, all of them. But to do that, we need significant voter registration and mobilization at the polls. And it may have been that this shock is what that takes, unfortunately. So that we were talking earlier about the shock that something like the overturning of Roe brings on, and we're already seeing that, especially with women under age 25 registering to vote in really astronomical numbers. So I would like to say optimistically it's impossible, but I would have said that 6 months ago about Roe versus Wade, and that happened. So I don't put anything in the category of impossible at this point, unfortunately.
Thank you. Leni. Die Einsetzung der Kommission.
Setting up this commission. Yes, the Commission Reproductive Self-Determination has been set up and will start working after the summer recess. We've had a debate raging over months whether or not to set up a commission, not a commission of inquiry. And when it's commissions of inquiry, honestly, I find it hard to understand that, because I could see us debating about it until the end of the government and nothing would happen. So I'm just happy that something has happened, and that reproductive self-determination is extremely important. It's not just Section 218. It's also about surrogate mothers and things like that. That's why this commission has been seconded to the Ministry of Health. I'd have liked to see more MPs on that commission. MPs are not represented there, but it was promised that there would be a flanking parliamentarian group. So this is the status as far as this commission is concerned. And Lena, if people like you didn't exist, I'd have probably thrown myself out of a basement window. I mean, I'm not trying to sit here and trying to act as if in my generation we were all sort of diplomat feminists. That's not true. I know that there are lots of people in the young generation as well. But what I find is lacking is the big social movement, the big social issue. And these are big social issues. We're debating it everywhere, not just on 8th of March or the Day Against Violence Against Women and so on. We are debating these matters throughout the year. Despite this, though, I notice sometimes that there are places where there is a certain lethargy. But I'm glad that, there are so many. I'm happy for everyone who fights the fight, because we don't get anything given to us, not even parity in Parliament, mind you. Now, I would like to allow the next 3 comments and or questions. Which one of you would like to comment?
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I'm from Brazil. I'm a PhD student. And I think my question is general for all the participants. I think the problem in all of we talk about here of the retrocesses and the threats of democracy, I regard are law and legislative actions. So I think it's really important that we think about vote mobilization, but also to ask who are these representatives and how can we change that? And I have an example in Brazil. I run an NGO where we look for women that are already leaders, that they weren't supposed to run for office, like they wouldn't think of it, but now they feel like recruited for that because of what we are living. So we recruit women from all the states that are already leaderships, and we train them with the rules, the electoral rules, because electoral rules are really secrets. They have monopolies, and they are restricted to some groups which are male and white. And Brazil is a country that is mostly black, but we don't see that in our representation. So we give them this training of 8 months to change people who can win, to form viable candidates, because it's not just saying, okay, women have to run, but what conditions do they have? They don't have money, they don't have the necessary capital. So we are doing that since 2020, but we only can reach 100 women, which is good, but we are talking about something that it's global. And as you said in the beginning, we have to think of global answers for this kind of demand. So my question is whether in your countries, Poland, US, and Germany, there are those kind of initiatives, and if there is the space that we can think this together, because I know it's important to have our 100 leaders, but it's not enough. We are talking of something so much bigger. And hearing you today, I was a little bit sad, because I was thinking, okay, Brazil is bad, everybody knows that, but I didn't know the size of, or how bad we were globally. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. The importance of cultural turn in leaderships in democracies, that's very, very interesting question. Thank you. Wir nehmen noch jemand, ich habe genau. Sie waren als zweites hintere.
You came second. In the center in front of the camera, please.
Hi, my name is Carla.
Hi, my name is Carla. I'm a student. I wanted to ask a question concerning the influence of right-wing extremists and evangelists. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this? How about their network? And what's the situation like in Germany? Because I think it became quite clear that this is a tremendous and very significant problem in the US. In Poland, too, the Catholic Church has very strong influence. I had the feeling that we are not yet there in Germany, that we don't have these strong parties trying to exert an influence, but maybe I'm wrong. I know that there are lobbyist groups and organizations that cooperate with very conservative groups in our society as well. But what is the extent and what do we have to do in the future? Thank you very much. Cynthia, first, please.
Yeah, I would just answer the first question really quickly. We have, first of all, thank you for the work. I think that's really, really important. And there is in the US some similar mobilization efforts, especially since 2016. So going back about 6 years, the biggest that I'm aware of is a group called She Should Run, which has been doing a lot of work on this front. I will say we are also struggling, and I think this is a problem globally as well. Certainly I've seen it here in Germany, with real disincentives for public officials for people to want to become public officials. There's a lot of threats, even against campaign, election workers, public school teachers, healthcare workers, but also elected officials, and those have been going up. So it's the anti-government extremism itself that is driving, and a lot of social media threats. So the costs of engaging are increasing as well. And I think part of what we have to work on is not just promoting the positive and encouraging and engaging people and training them, but teaching people how to protect themselves and continuing to invest in ways to combat that disinformation landscape, but also the threats, and undermine some of those efforts that are successfully off-ramping people who might otherwise be willing to become engaged in the leadership roles.
Thank you. Camilla, in Poland, are there groups or initiatives to push a cultural turn in leadership questions and educational topics?
Yeah, actually, can you hear me? Yes. Actually, we don't have enough initiatives about female candidates. And we have parliamentary elections at stake. They will be next year. So yeah, we are as NGOs mobilizing right now about the elections, and we are going to at least, this is a good idea to mobilize female candidates and to make the backup for them, prepare them. But actually, we have right now in Poland the coalition of feminist, progressive organizations. We have circa about 100 such organizations in one coalition called Coalition for Equality and Choice. And although we haven't prepared the initiative about female candidates, we have the initiative about asking candidates for parliamentary elections about their attitude towards abortion, LGBTQ rights, minority rights, and all such issues, all issues concerning human rights protection. Right now we can see the change in the debate that even conservative, central conservative parties who are starting the elections, they change their mind about abortion. They are more liberal right now. They are talking about changing this so-called bad compromise, abortion compromise. They are talking about introducing abortion free of barriers in Poland up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. We can't remember when last time we had such legislation on abortion in Poland. This is a huge change that, in fact, we can see the tendency that only the ruling Law and Justice Party and the Confederation, very right-wing fundamentalist party, are going to the corner of being regressive, and other parties want to look like rather progressive ones. So this is quite a change, because a few years ago, they wanted to be considered as rather central conservative parties who want to sustain status quo. And right now, it's impossible to sustain status quo, because status quo has been ruined and was not satisfactory for anyone. But coming back to this coalition for equality and the choice, we as the coalition prepared a publication about the strategies of anti-gender fundamentalist movements in Poland. And we think this can be a helpful material for policymakers, and we try to bring those topics to the public debate to show what are the strategies of manipulation, what are strategies of hijacking the human rights language, what are the connections between anti-gender movements and the government. The former president of such anti-gender organization is also the former vice minister for foreign affairs. The connections is very clear. So what we are trying to do is to bring the topic to the public debate and to make the issue of abortion rights, LGBTQ rights as the main topics of the parliamentary debate.
Ja, dann Leni, auch nochmal an dich die Frage.
Loni, back to you. Once again, the question is, which lobby comes from the Catholic churches in Germany and manages to influence the positions in the German parliament and implement its own idea? Is that tangible amongst parliamentarians? Because many members of parliament have the C, Christian, in their party's name. Does the church have a very strong influence on the national parliament? It's not the church alone, you see, because we have very friendly discussions, and this is where we do not wage these discussions with the churches. We talk about assisted dying or similar aspects. But there are hundreds and hundreds of organizations the world over who are very well interconnected the world over, and they try to see to it that these lawsuits will be submitted against Section 219A. They have tremendous financial resources, but you don't always know where the money comes from, because otherwise it would be easier to call a spade a spade. The Catholic Church is really in serious trouble right now, because there are so many cases of misuse and abuse which have not been investigated upon as strongly as they should have, so they are not really in the good press at the current moment in time. But there are many other radical groups and movements in Germany. They want to have mom, dad, 2 kids, a boy and a girl. That is the most appropriate structure for women to stay at home. And here our history differs profoundly from the history of mothers in other countries, because at the time of National Socialism, things were aggravated even further. Up until 1977, we had a civil code in place where it said, literally, Section 1353, the woman runs the household out of her own responsibility. She is entitled to find a job as long as this is in line with her obligations within the family and the household. And it is still very much deeply rooted in people's minds. And they stick to that principle once again. You always have to fight very hard against these old traditional ideologies. So there are a lot of tendencies currently underway, but we have to talk about this openly. Friedrich Ebert Foundation and other organizations have published very good studies. On to the next question. I think our systems differ profoundly compared with the one in Brazil. When we talk about gender equality, well, when I talk about gender equality, I speak about time, power, and money. The same holds true for elections. How much time do I have? How much time can I invest into the party's work, with the executive party's meetings, putting up posters? Do I have the time in order to move into a powerful position? And do I have the right amount of money that needs to be invested? Although here we don't really need that much money. There are parties where money matters most. But I was also told that there are people who say, well, if you want to run as a candidate, you have to have tens and thousands of euros. But it's something I'm not at all familiar with. I think here things work differently. I'm a member of the Electoral Rights Commission. I really enjoy that, and I joined it because of parity. And you talk about making the number of MPs smaller, the period of the legislative term, election age, 16 or 18. Very often we agree with the coalition agreements, but when it comes to parity, we don't agree because, you know, the meetings are not are public. You can actually watch them, but the liberals always say that no, this is stuff of the devil because, you know, we need more tables for changing the nappies in the toilets. Yes, you can do that, but the Greens managed to move into that direction, the Social Democrats managed to move into that direction, and the Liberals don't. Now, for 70 years, we have not yet managed to have an equal number of women in the national parliament. We need legal provisions. That's what parity is all about, an equal number of men and women in our parliament. When the interim report of the Electoral Rights Commission will be published, I hope that then we will manage to bring about a strong level of mobilization. Same number of men and women in our parliament, fine. 103 years of electoral law, one. But still we have 130 women in the national parliament. That's really deplorable, also at the federal state level. That's what we're currently working on in Germany. I think the formal conditions are the same for each and every one. I don't have to get registered as a woman in order to push my rights through. Everything's quite clear, but go for it. And then you have to drag women along who are trying to fight their cause. Push them from the bottom and pull them from the top. I'm not an MP of the SPD, or I was the Verdi Trade Union Services chairperson for many years because I'm so brilliant, but you always need people who support you. I was always supported by women, and that must be something that we can take for granted. We as women need to support each other. We don't have to wait for them to become 110% perfect, but let's keep on moving. These women who are on the move deserve our support. And then Rolf Mützenich is a much nicer person than Mrs. von Storch or Mrs. Weigel from the AfD. You know, ongoing female solidarity is not really something that I want to go for. But I want to have 50% of MPs being women in our national parliament because we want women to make their voices heard with all the pros and cons, and we want to have women who are trained at the age of 16 and tell us what their life is like. You know, this is something that needs to be accounted when laws are passed, and we're in the process of working on that. And during the next 3 meetings of the Electoral Law Committee, we will look at exactly these questions. What do you need money for? How does it work? How come that women normally don't win the elections in constituencies, but men do? You know, we all have to take a look at the obstacles which are still in our way, but we're working on that. It's quite a nice discussion, but we are not yet there. A lot still remains to be done, and I hope that we will get there. It will take a lot more because the only ones who really want to go for it are the ones who don't have the majority. The SPD, the Linke and the Greens and all the others don't want it. But now the union is actually moving into the right direction in order to bring about a women's quota. And then maybe we will manage to make some more progress. Thank you very much, Leni. Right, I think slowly but surely we are running out of time. Now let me give the panelists the chance to give us an outlook. What can we do immediately or in the long run? As individuals, what can be done in order to make our voices heard? Self-determination must not be accompanied with hollowing out legal rights of individuals. And what can be done? Camilla, would you like to start off? What do you expect from your European neighbors? What do you expect from your co-activists coming from the US? What can we do jointly in order to support you actively as an activist from Poland? And how can we become more European when we develop joint strategies to counter anti-feminism?
Definitely, I think we should create, because we need transnational political strategy of defense against anti-feminism, against anti-gender movements. We already started to write reports, to diagnose the problem, to exchange views as we are doing right now, and it's really nice that you all showed up and came and wanted to listen to us, ask questions. This is the job to be done by individuals, to ask questions, but also to speak up about those issues, to have a very clear position. And this is what I would require for politicians, and what would I ask for individuals. Everyone, everybody is an activist in their own life. So I think we need to show clear position on abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, without hesitation, without shame, without stigmatization. And what is very close to my, let's say, universal imagination is to linking abortion rights, women's rights, human rights, with nowadays problems of working class, to show that women who are workers may need abortion, whatever their political or religious identity is. Showing that abortion rights, which means giving the choice to the person that is, in the middle of the problem, is a pro-family policy. That if we want to have more families around us, although it's not an obligation to start a family, but if we would like to encourage, we cannot take away the autonomy, the feeling of having power over our own future. So we need a strong voice that, in fact, banning abortions, banning LGBT rights is anti-family policies, because they wanted to conceive us that that family policies means giving, for example, social supports, but only in one direction, but with taking away your rights at the same time. And we need to show, we need to prove that pro-family policies, pro-working people policies is about doing both. Giving your freedom, giving your rights back, giving the choice to you, and support you at the same time. So I think this thinking in a way of solidarity between different social groups, which sometimes can, in the first place may seem to be contradictory, but they don't. I think this is a solution for us for the future to bring back the real meaning of human rights, which was taken from us. This is from me. Thank you.
Cynthia, gerade jetzt.
Cynthia, right now, here in Germany, the government has been ringing in a change in foreign policy terms. So we're going to stand more firmly side by side with our NATO partners. Canada is becoming one of our most important partners. We've just had the G7 summit, and they also discussed reproductive rights and international solutions for these matters. What would you like to see happening, speaking from a US perspective? What should Europe do? How can we work together on these subjects? And how can one support one another? And not just in the ivory tower of academia, universities, but more at the grassroots
So I would say there are a few different things here. One, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we sometimes focus so much on promotion of the good, but don't think enough about fighting the bad. And so I often talk about this in the, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we act sometimes as if we can just lift up all the great things and promote, but when there's so much propaganda and disinformation and conspiracy theory and work to undermine kind of human rights understandings, but also understandings of equality and reproductive rights in this case, we have to work on both ends simultaneously. And I will say that's the side that I work on the prevention of disinformation, propaganda, persuasive rhetoric online. We know that in that field, there's tremendous collaboration in two different ways. One, the sort of extremists themselves are extremely well networked online and working well across borders using social media. But also the security folks, law enforcement, intelligence communities, monitoring are doing an excellent job of working across borders and sharing information. We see very little on the civil society prevention side in terms of practitioners coming together across borders. That funding hasn't been made available for the most, at least between the US and Europe. I think a lot more is happening across Europe, I would say. We have a little bit of it going on in a nascent way, but I think the more that we can collaborate and communicate across borders, bring frontline practitioners together, both in healthcare workers, but also teachers, educators, social workers, mental health counselors, people who are working on the ground to understand and learn from promising practices overseas, that's helpful. The second thing I would say is we need, I think, to build better stories, and we can learn from each other on that side. I think conservative and far-right movements are very good at building compelling and emotionally appealing stories. They have simple storylines and narratives that draw people to them, that are rooted in things like protection of your family, that have drawn mothers in. So we often talk about women as if just getting more women elected is going to solve our problem, but we all know that that's not actually what happens. And in fact, in our own Supreme Court, we've seen that happen, right? So you can't only rely on gender as a solution itself. We have to have stories that talk about what, and this is, I think, what we were just hearing about, how can you embed reproductive rights as a pro-family or a pro-choice story? How can you understand that part of the story is about government interference in your body or in your choices? Because that is a story that appeals to a lot of people who are worried about government interference. But the sort of the conservative narrative has been stronger and has been a clearer and stronger line. And then I would just say, and I'm echoing what's already been said here, but I think the more we can forge solidarity across all of the threatened categories here, so that we understand that reproductive rights today are what we see in the US, leading to challenges to LGBTQ communities in same-sex marriage tomorrow, most likely. That these are linked not only because of the legal precedent, but because of the sense of threat that pervades across. And so solidarity across borders, and solidarity across issues, across identity groups is the only way I think we start to see our way out of this mess. And that's the final thing I'll say, is that I think, and I did not do a good job of this tonight, so I apologize, but we do have to offer hope in some way, right? And I think there has to be, people need a vision for the future that they can grab onto, and that gets back to the storytelling. We cannot only present negative takes, and because you end up with the way that a lot of people individually feel about climate change, which is hopeless, right? They feel hopeless about it. And we cannot, I think, forge ahead, even with tremendous solidarity, even with great stories, if we don't also offer some hope. So I apologize for not doing a great job of that. It's a depressing moment to go back to the States right now, but I promise if I come back again, I will come with more hope.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you very much. Leni, you herself has already said, sort of taking this matter prematurely. You said that 219A, Section 219A being abolished is a milestone, but not the end of the road. What sort of support would you like to see from us, Social Democrats, international support? What is it that you need in order to take the next steps tackling that issue? What I would like to see is to get the men and women who are in responsibility get supportive by us. That we tell them what you're doing is right. When I think about editors and journalists, if they've written any smart piece and contribution or op-ed, they're really getting a lot of flack, good and bad, of course, sometimes criticism. And I think in politics, I'd like to see a positive mail coming in, say, a voter telling me, I like what you're doing, and I think we should all do that. Support people in this way. And the other matter is this thing. I mean, I'm really totally in favor of international networking. And in my position, I'm sometimes allowed to travel. And in March, for example, I was able to go to the Women's Rights Commission in New York, Women and Climate. And next year we're talking about women and digitization. I'll go there, and sometimes I think, what will I do? Will I give a presentation about what I heard there? So in other words, I've been there, but what will come out of it? And first of all, I'm sticking with Europe for the time being, but I thought this sort of red lightning of the polls was absolutely fantastic. The Polish women have shown that a joint logo could be very good. It's a joint signal telling people what we want and what we can do and want to achieve for women, for people in Europe. That's a very strong signal for freedom, self-determination, rights. If we can get that off the ground, it would be great. And, I have some buttons made and so on. I mean, if people tell a story about what happens there, if you tell people, you immediately get solidarity in the smallest local groups. And that is the way a movement can spring up. And internationally, we've achieved the WHO, at least, to say that, yes, we are all agreed that access to safe, high-quality medical abortion is a human right for every woman. We've got there right now. We should be aware of that. So other people are violating this. And where are they violating it? That's what we need to address. And I think we need to understand that there is a lot we've already achieved. And now, of course, I'm finding it rather difficult since I've already frustrated young people with my comments on youth. But quite honestly, I'm absolutely certain we will win. We will win because we're right. We've achieved so much already, and we are going to get the rest done as well, all over Europe. And I'm confident of this because I see Maria Leuchen there and the ASF federal chair. I mean, it's the wonderful European MP. Whenever I want to look at Poland, I call Maria and she tells me what is true, and my English is so appalling, abysmal. It's sometimes difficult, direct contact, but there are other people who are better at that, despite the language barrier. So wherever we can, let's network, let's exchange views and also encourage each other. I think the pandemic has also had a good side in this respect because our work, our concern, and all the matters that women achieve has been what we call systemically relevant. And we need to build on that, and we need to demand that to be recognized, that we want to live a good life and that we want to have parity, 50% men, women, that we don't want to be having our toxic men imposing their will on us. And there are some, we've seen that in a whole generation, we've seen changes happening, and now they want to grab back what they think they lost, and they want to do so violently. We want to make sure we prevent them from doing that, and we will win. Thank you very much, Leni. This was a wonderful final comment. So what can we do? When can we become active? I've done a bit of research on that. And indeed, the pro-life movement has called for a meeting 17 September 2022. They want people to march on Berlin, a march pro-life is what it's going to be about. It's happened since 2004, where anti-abortionists from all over Germany group together, come to Berlin, demonstrate in Berlin, demonstrate against abortion. And the question, it was not the AfD, even though Ms. Storch, an AfD MP, is always at the forefront, but it was a Regensburg bishop, Dr. Vorderholzer, who calls us all to march to Berlin and to join the pro-life march. And he says, I quote, interrupting pregnancy should not be declared a normal medical practice. This does not constitute progress. It's a step back. Please organize in your family, among your friends, in clubs. Join the march pro-life. We take over the costs and make sure you can protect unborn life, and particularly with a view to what we just discussed, they also say against the current abolition of Section 219A. It sounds so harmless, it reaches out a lot of people. There are always counter-demonstrations, not that numerous, I might add, even in Berlin, where people demonstrate against this march. So if any of you are interested in watching what is happening, and there is a comment off mic, which of course your interpreters could not catch, we apologize. You can always look at where some of these people gather. You can watch critically what they're doing. You might join a counter-demonstrations. I'll certainly try to see what is going on, maybe join a counter-demonstration. So this would be one little spark we could light. If we put up a face mask with a red lightning sign on it, that would already be a good statement. It's one way in which we can try to fight against anti-feminism. I thought that was a good suggestion. And now I can only ask you to please stay with us, go on talking to your neighbors, to the people sitting next to you. And please, let's also make sure we can speak a little longer. And we're going to be able to go out. It's a wonderful insect hotel we have out there. Many of the bushes are in bloom, so it's going to be a lovely evening. And you can also have an engaged and committed discussion. We're very happy that you were with us and you were so actively involved. Thank you very much, everybody.